Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam. Pam, it's an election year. I'm sure you know that. And as a scholar of the electoral system and voting rights, this must be kind of a hectic time for you in terms of people asking you, how did we get here? And why do we have this seemingly odd system with caucuses and primaries and the Electoral College?
Yeah, I mean, the American election system is not something that anybody would have designed by scratch this way. And with us today to talk about this is one of our colleagues, Michael McConnell, who is the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law at the Law School, a former Court of Appeals judge, also a former assistant to the Solicitor General, former professor at the University of Chicago, and somebody who, at a dinner once that I had with Justice William Brennan, told me was one of the two smartest people he had ever met, although he often didn't agree with him. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Michael.
Nice to be back.
Yes,
welcome back.
It is indeed. So Michael is not just one of the most eminent constitutional law professors in the country, but also somebody who really focuses on the history of how we got to where we are. So how did we end up with a president, and how did we end up with the election system for a president that we have?
Well, the president was actually pretty easy. Everyone wanted an executive branch. When we went into the Constitutional Convention, this was one of the few points on which everybody was agreed, and the reason for that is that we didn't have one during the period between independence and the Constitution. We had just a Congress, and they tried to do everything by committee. And if anybody's ever been on a committee, you can testify, that just doesn't work. And so we knew we had one. Now, they weren't quite sure that it ought to be one executive. Edmund Randolph, for example, thought it would be good to have three, a three-headed executive. France was going to try that just a couple years after our Constitution.
Didn't
France
go so
did
well
try
for the
that.
French.
Napoleon was the first consul, and we know how well that worked out.
Who were the second and third? Exactly.
Now, choosing the president was enormously difficult. They went round and round about how to do that. Initially, they thought, let the Congress choose the president. At that time, all but two of the state governors were chosen by their state legislatures, but they quickly realized that if they did it that way, the president would not be independent and could not serve really as a check. Our checks and balances system wouldn't work if the two leading political branches were dependent upon each other. So what they principally were looking for was a way to choose a president that would have where he would stand on a different footing than the Congress. At the very beginning, James Wilson proposed popular election, and a lot of people favored that. Hamilton favored that. Gouverneur Morris favored that. But the main problem with it was simply in the technology of the day, the electoral infrastructure of the day. It would have been very difficult to do that. And since every state had different qualifications for voting, it would mean, that states that had loose qualifications would have more influence than the others, and that didn't seem to be tolerable. So at the time when the Electoral College was dreamed up, it was actually viewed by most of them as being about as close to popular election as as we could get.
Yeah, and of course they didn't expect when they put the Electoral College together that there would be two national political parties of the kind that we have.
No, they had no idea. They really thought people would vote for sort of local heroes, the people that they knew, and they thought that most ordinary Americans would not be familiar with figures from other states. So that was another problem. Most people did not expect any individual to command a majority nationwide after George Washington. Everybody knew Washington would be the first.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Michael McConnell about the presidential election system. Joe?
But of course, it wasn't too long before parties did appear on the scene. So if our framers were spot on in some ways, they kind of missed that one, I think. And we've had parties now for a long time. And today it seems like our electoral process, the parties are really embedded in it because we have official roles for the parties state by state still.
That's right. I mean, I think in many ways, you're quite right. They did not anticipate parties to the extent that they thought about them. They viewed them as conspiracies against the public interest, much the way Republicans and Democrats think of each other today. Terrible thing. But in many ways, I think the political parties solved many of the problems of democratic organization that our framers just simply didn't think about. They gave remarkably little attention to the way that democracy would actually operate in the United States, and the political parties served to solve many of those coordination problems.
And basically, you have to be nominated by one of the two major political parties to have any realistic chance of being elected president. I mean, we've never had an independent candidate who got more than about 15 or 20% of the vote, have we?
No. Well, that does amount to millions of votes.
Yes,
but you're
yes.
quite right about now that. That's partly because our elections are organized on the basis of districts or states with first past the post elections. So you can't win by picking up, a few votes here and a few votes there. You actually have to carry, geographically defined places, and that makes a two-party system almost inevitable.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is so interesting about our two-party system is, as you say, you have to win a state to get that state's electoral votes. Now, there are two states that divvy up their electoral votes among the candidates, depending on the percentage each candidate wins. But the other states, if you win the state by two people out of millions of votes cast, you get all of that state's electoral votes.
And the Constitution leaves it to the state legislatures to decide, which system they're going to use. And there's a reason why most states go the other way, which is that one party or the other is in charge. And generally speaking, they think that their candidate is going to win most of the time, and they don't want to give away. So with California, for example, we have, 55 electoral votes? Well, the Republicans would probably pick up, 10, 15 of those.
And vice versa in Texas.
Yeah, and vice versa in Texas. But the Democrats in California won't do it, and the Republicans in Texas won't do it. The only states that do it in any other way are these sort of oddball, not very partisan states like Maine.
Yeah.
And what do you think? This might be an occasion to drop where we are and just think of, if you could press a button, Michael, would you keep that? Or if all states came to you and they said, look, we could all do this together, and of course, in any one time, giving this up will help one party and hurt the other party. So right now, savvy political observers know that giving up the kind of first past the post, winner take all, would probably help the Democrats, hurt the Republicans. But would we be less partisan if we gave that up, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure we would have anything like the Electoral College at all if we were just making it up. But let's pretend for a moment we're going to have an Electoral College. I think, and there are certain advantages we get from it, maybe not on balance making it worth keeping, but still there are some good things about the Electoral College. I think most of those would be achieved if we did it on this district-by-district basis the way Maine does, and we would lose very little, and it would reduce the likelihood of a difference between popular vote and electoral vote, and I think be more democratic, but still retaining the virtues
Would
of
you
the
do
Electoral
it
College.
proportionally or district by district? Because the problem with district by district is if you have gerrymandered districts, then you're going to have a gerrymandered outcome in the Electoral College too, right?
Well, that's true, but I do think that the districts make more it almost has to be by districts, I think, for the logic of the Electoral College to work. And one of the sort of side advantages of the Electoral College is the way in which it induces the presidential candidates to pay attention to places, that they're not just out picking up votes. They actually have to go and deal with Iowa or deal with Nevada or whatever it happens to be.
But they don't deal with Texas or California at all, right? Because everybody knows that the Democrats are going to win in California. I mean, one of the things that amazed me was a couple of elections ago, I think it might have been in 2004, I was in North Carolina the week before the election, and it was wall-to-wall ads on TV for presidential candidates. In California, there was literally not a single ad, probably the entire election
Great
season.
blessing for being a Californian,
I know.
isn't it? I live in California and spend a lot of my time at our cabin in Utah, two one-party states, although from the opposite parties, and I don't have to listen to political ads.
Yeah, so one of the things the Supreme Court has in front of it this year, which I think our listeners might be interested to know about, is a set of cases about what to do with the so-called faithless elector, which is when you vote for a presidential candidate, you think you're going into the booth to vote for the candidate, but you're actually voting for electors who are pledged to support that candidate. And the Supreme Court has in front of it this question of, well, what happens if the majority of voters in a state go into the booth and vote for Donald Trump, and then one of the electors pledged to Donald Trump decides, no, I'm going to cast my vote for Mike Pence, or I'm going to cast my vote for any random Republican, or indeed I'm going to cast my vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is.
Yes, and of course this has happened from the very beginning. They didn't used to call them faithless because, toward the beginning, no one really thought that they had any obligation. But in the very first presidential elections, the electors, divided their votes, especially among the people who had become, vice president. You may wonder, how did Thomas Jefferson get chosen to be John Adams's vice president?
I saw the show.
Since they were opposite political parties. Well,
yeah.
The reason for that is that a number of Adams electors threw their votes away from the Adams's running mate, leaving Jefferson to win. And so there have been these so-called faithless electors all along. This reflects the original idea that the voters didn't necessarily know who they should be voting for president, and so they would choose someone in whom they had faith locally to choose for them. And so it has never worked out that way, that not a single election actually went where electors were totally choosing on their own. But this is a relic of that. I think as a legal matter, it is I predict, I hate to predict the Supreme Court because I'm usually wrong, but I predict the Supreme Court is going to hold that faithless electors have a constitutional right to be faithless, and states can't. In one of these cases, the states are trying to criminally punish electors who are faithless. I find it very difficult to believe that's going to be allowed.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about the presidential election system with our colleague Michael McConnell. Joe?
Michael, one of the issues that we thought about talking about was superdelegates, because we have a primary process, and it's embedded in state law. But talk to us about the parties. Each party, of course, is in charge of the primary process, and they can, to some extent, and they can weight it one way or the other. Is that long-standing? Are there issues that are legal issues, moral issues with that, do you think?
Well, Joe, I think this goes to a really important question structurally, but it is not a constitutional question. Our Constitution doesn't touch this at all. And I begin with the question, what are the parties doing? What are the parties, and what is all their role in this? And for a very long time, the parties were themselves sort of independent private associations who put up candidates. And so the candidates were the candidates of the party. And then in the 20th century, there started to be primaries, but there weren't that many primaries. As recently as 1960 with the JFK election, there were a handful of primaries, and they were viewed as kind of bellwether. They were sources of information for the party as to, which candidates would actually be popular out on the hustings. But the parties weren't bound to choose who was going to be chosen. It was only with the McGovern reforms in 1972 that the Democrats and then the Republicans moved to a system in which the vast majority of the delegates are chosen by popular primary election. And one thing that did is it really meant that the parties lost control over their own choice. So it really is no longer true that the Democratic Party presents its best shot for a candidate. Instead, they're kind of victims of whomever manages to win all these elections around the country. And then the superdelegates were a proposal to try to mitigate the effect of that, and in a sense move back toward the idea that parties would be actual agents, actual principals, and who make judgments about these things. And the superdelegates are intended to be the experienced, wise, I don't know if they're wise, but at least experienced politicians who have held offices like governor or, state legislator, that sort of thing in their own state, and would be a less democratic check upon the primaries. I personally believe that's a very good idea. If I were writing the rules, I would have more superdelegates and protect them. But the Democrats particularly have found it difficult to defend this institution. So they pretend to be more democratic, small d democratic, than they really are, and so the superdelegates don't seem right to them. But that is only because there's a kind of philosophy that says that the parties should be controlled by votes rather than the parties themselves exercising judgment.
We'll be back with more from our guest Michael McConnell talking about presidential elections next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Joe?
Hi, Pam. Again. Before the break, we're talking with Michael McConnell, our colleague, and we were talking about parties and delegates and superdelegates. And Michael, what you were explaining is that the notion that parties ought to simply reflect popular vote of their members in choosing a slate is kind of a recent notion. As 50 years ago, that wasn't thought to be the case. And we could imagine that parties would decide who best reflects their interests, maybe best reflects who's going to govern in accordance with their principles. I imagine, for example, the Republican Party would not have chosen Donald Trump 4 years ago had the party insiders been in charge of selecting a candidate.
That certainly seems likely, and it seems very likely that the Democrats would not be paying much attention to Bernie Sanders, or maybe even to very many of the candidates that they now have competing. So it seems to me that the great political parties had a job to do, and their job was to was to present to the American people a candidate who would who had a serious possibility of commanding a majority, and then who would be able to govern credibly. And I think the two parties have been, in a sense, defanged so that they can't do that anymore. Now their job is simply to, organize the debates and let the candidates compete. And all the money now goes to it's because of the idiocy of our campaign finance laws.
I was just about to actually ask you about that,
the
Michael.
Big money can't even flow through the parties. The big money is independent of that, and that means that politics has become a kind of entrepreneurial, independent operation, not governed by these more staid, repeat players. Now, I may betray my centrism here in believing in the parties, but it might be that there's an occasional wonderful outsider whom we would miss if this was the system. But I think if you're risk averse, we're much more likely to avoid presidents who are not going to be able to unify the country and not be able to work with the other side and not be able to govern effectively. And that to me seems like a pretty good trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of alluded to the campaign finance issue, which was also a kind of outgrowth of the 1970s, and the Supreme Court really kind of rewriting the campaign finance laws that Congress attempted to pass to be a kind of law that no one would pass, which is a law that restricts contributions to political parties but doesn't restrict in any way independent spending. And so the money has all kind of flowed out of the parties to independent organizations, and every time Congress tries to chase down that money, it just gets pushed further and further out in the system. And on top of that, we also have a changed media environment than we had 30 or 40 years ago. How does that affect, in your view, the presidential elections?
Well, we certainly do. It used to be that most large cities had one or two newspapers, and then there were three networks. And so there was a kind of and the economics of the three networks is it tends to, when you have three, they tend to clump somewhat toward the middle. Once you have, I think all it takes is four, and there's a mathematics behind this, that it becomes advantageous for one network, the fourth network, to become a niche player. That's Fox. And then once Fox does that, the other three become more radicalized and more homogeneous on the left. And instead of having, three more or less homogeneous networks, we end up having a more polarized media environment. Now, I'm not sure the old system was very good. It was in my opinion, too tightly controlled by too narrow a group. I think having more internet voices and so forth has been a good thing, but it's a good thing that also, like with many good things, it has some unfortunate side effects too.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Michael McConnell about the presidential election system. Joe?
I'm wondering, Michael, as I hear you kind of expound on this and talk about the old days where parties made more knowing choices, my guess is a lot of listeners right now would push a button to go back there. I don't know if that's true of all of our listeners. It might be an age thing because nobody at this table we're not millennials. But do you think, and I'm going to throw this open to Pam, do you think that our position is broadly shared? Is that there's nothing legal or illegal about what the parties are doing? They could go back to superdelegates. It seems almost unthinkable now.
I think we're in a kind of odd populist moment where people feel that they want to be heard on everything, but they're very dissatisfied with the structures through which they're heard. I mean, if you look at what's happening with elections, like every other institution in America, the trust in those institutions has gone down precipitously over the last 20 or 30 years. It's very hard to figure out cause and effect there. But no one would have the system we have now where Iowa, a state that's not particularly representative, holds a bunch of caucuses, and those are an in or out moment for candidates. I mean, no one would have the system we have now where the parties are both expected to run a process and are incredibly weakened. It's not I think Michael was right earlier when he said this is not a system anybody would have designed to look like this.
So I do think there's some good things about the party choosing system that we could preserve, and if we did them in a slightly different way. So I think a real problem would be that candidates that no one knows wouldn't have a chance.
Right.
And so I think it's actually quite good that small states like New Hampshire and Iowa have such an outsized role, because candidates can go, they can actually meet real human beings. My sister-in-law lives in New Hampshire, and she literally meets most of the candidates, and many of them more than once. The problem is these two particular states. Why is it Iowa and New Hampshire? They are not very representative. There are other small states that could perform the role. Rhode Island, for example,
I was just
would be
thinking that.
much more representative of the Democratic Party constituency than Iowa is, or better yet, spread them around. How about a rule that no state gets to do it, more than once in a row, and spread it. But I do think having small states toward the beginning is a very good feature. I also, however terribly the caucuses worked, and I would not want very many caucus states, but to have a few caucus states as part of the process, I think is a good thing, because the thing about caucuses is that people actually talk to one another about who they're going to choose. I think one of the reasons why Pete Buttigieg emerged higher in Iowa than you might have thought from the advanced polling is that people in Iowa, were sitting around and they were actually talking about the disaster facing the Democratic Party and thinking, well, how can we get out of this? What's the escape hatch? And Mayor Pete turns out to be the escape hatch.
Well, we've been talking to Michael McConnell about elections, and of course, Pam, you're an expert on elections as well. And one of the interesting things I think about this conversation is it hasn't really been so much about the law, because so much of what is key about elections has to do with the parties, and the parties actually could behave much differently than they're behaving now. They could have different caucus systems. They could have more party control and less popular control. And I think this is something maybe for our listeners to think about, because who knows, Michael, maybe we'll have started a movement right here on Sirius Radio.
So thanks to our listeners for joining us, and thanks to Michael McConnell for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM.